Letter 28. To the Honourable Daines Barrington, Selborne, January 8, 1776. Dear Sir, it is the hardest thing in the world to shake off superstitious prejudices. They are sucked in, as it were, with our mother's milk, and growing up with us at a time when they take the fastest hold and make the most lasting impressions, become so interwoven into our very constitutions, that the strongest good sense is required to disengage ourselves from them. No wonder, therefore, that the lower people retain them their whole lives through, since their minds are not invigorated by a liberal education, and therefore not enabled to make any efforts adequate to the occasion. Such a preamble seems to be necessary before we enter on the superstitions of this district, lest we should be suspected of exaggeration in a recital of practices too gross for this enlightened age. But the people of Tring in Herefordshire would do well to remember that no longer ago than the year 1751, and within 20 miles of the capital, they seized on 2 superannuated wretches, crazed with age, and overwhelmed with infirmities, on a suspicion of witchcraft, and, by trying experiments, drowned them in a horse-pond. In a farmyard near the middle of this village stands at this day a row of pollard ashes, which, by the seams and long cicatrices down their sides, manifestly show that, in former times, they have been cleft asunder. These trees, when young and flexible, were severed and held open by wedges, while ruptured children, stripped naked, were pushed through the apertures, under a persuasion that, by such a process, the poor babes would be cured of their infirmity. As soon as the operation was over, the tree, in the suffering part, was plastered with loam and carefully swathed up. If the parts coalesced and soldered together, as usually fell out, where the feat was performed with any adroitness at all, the party was cured. But, where the cleft continued to gape, the operation, it was supposed, would prove ineffectual. Having occasion to enlarge my garden not long since, I cut down 2 or 3 such trees, one of which did not grow together. We have several persons now living in the village who, in their childhood, were supposed to be healed by this superstitious ceremony, derived down perhaps from our Saxon ancestors, who practised it before their conversion to Christianity. At the south corner of the plestor, or area, near the church, there stood, about 20 years ago, a very old, grotesque, hollow pollard ash, which for ages had been looked on with no small veneration as a shrew ash. Now, a shrew ash is an ash whose twigs or branches, when gently applied to the limbs of cattle, will immediately relieve the pains which a beast suffers from the running of a shrew-mouse over the part affected. For it is supposed that a shrew-mouse is of so baneful and deleterious a nature, that wherever it creeps over a beast, be it horse, cow, or sheep, the suffering animal is afflicted with cruel anguish, and threatened with the loss of the use of the limb. Against this accident, to which they were continually liable, our provident forefathers always kept a shrew ash at hand, which, when once medicated, would maintain its virtue forever. A shrew ash was made thus. Footnote. For a similar practice, see Plott's Staffordshire. End footnote. Into the body of the tree a deep hole was bored with an auger, and a poor devoted shrew mouse was thrust in alive and plugged in, no doubt, with several quaint incantations long since forgotten. As the ceremonies necessary for such a consecration are no longer understood, all succession is at an end, and no such tree is known to subsist in the manor or hundred. As to that on the Plestor, the late vicar stubbed and burnt it, when he was way warden, regardless of the remonstrances of the bystanders, who interceded in vain for its preservation, urging its power and efficacy, and alleging that it had been religione patra multo servata per annos. I am, etc. Reader's note. Protected through the years by the reverence of our fathers. Translation A.S. Klein. End note.